I am Emma Gage. I'm BITC's Head of Cost of Living, and it is a pleasure and a privilege to be with you all today on this really important topic of targeting social mobility and the cost of living crisis. So BITC's cost of living campaign is built on our 40 years of responsible business campaigning, and we are helping business right now in this crisis to take action to help employees, customers, communities and suppliers. Today we're focusing on employees and one of our 12 calls to action, which is on targeting social mobility, which is on targeting and using data to support those that are most disproportionately impacted. And social mobility is one of the things that you as businesses, as organisations and leaders have come to us and said that you would like some more support on. So that is what brings us here today. An incredibly timely discussion. You will have seen, I'm sure, the ONS data that came out that showed towards the end of March and early April, 75% of the UK population are still experiencing a rise in the cost of living. So, really important for us to come together today and look at how we can support more. So we have an incredible lineup. Hi, Andy from University of Warwick, just saw your message pop up, good to see you. So we've got an incredible lineup for you today. At this moment, I'd love to ask my colleagues in events to put the slide up that shows our speakers, please. So there we are, there are our speakers for today. So I'll be facilitating the event. And then we have 25 minutes where we have a really interesting panel from our brilliant speakers chaired by Neha. Then we move through to case studies from Capita and the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, and as well from BITC and our insights. And then you will have heard all of that content, and we'll be into a space for you for Q&A and anything that you want to ask our panel. We wanted to start with as well, we're looking at employees right now and the supporting and the tailoring, but this is part of a much bigger cost of living action plan that we've got going at BITC, so loads more going on, so please do stay tuned. So without further ado, we're about to hand over to the panel, and I wonder if we've got a moment to have the poll now, events team, or if we would rather go straight into the panel.
I'll just pop the poll up now for you.
Amazing. So really our purpose here with this poll is, are you targeting support? So are you targeting support towards your lower income and disproportionately impacted employees in the cost of living crisis using workforce data? Yes, no, planning to.
Yeah, that'll be good.
Yeah. So I don't know if I'll give you a couple more moments to respond to that. And that will really help our panel, because they'll know exactly where you are when they come to speak. Okay, and the results are in. So yes, 48% of you are currently targeting support. No, 30% of you are not, and 22% are planning. So just over half of you aren't doing this already. So I think this is an incredibly timely webinar and panel. So without further ado, I would love at this point to hand over to Neha and the rest of the panel to introduce themselves. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about the discussion.
Thank you so much, Emma, and hello everyone. So brilliant to have so many of you with us today. So I'm Neha Sajani. I'm an Impact Director at Business in the Community, and I cover our strategy, content and research function. I'm really delighted to be chairing this really essential panel discussion today, and we're going to focus on social mobility, data and inequality. We've got our wonderful panelists, Caitlin, David and our very own Jodie with us today. So I'm just going to take a moment to invite each of you to introduce yourselves formally. So Caitlin, could I start with you?
Thanks so much, Neha. Really pleased to be here today. My name is Kinsella and I work for Capita. We are a global business processing, outsourcing professional services company with around 50,000 people around the globe and around 35,000 in the UK. Really passionate about this topic. We have a big proportion of our workforce who are in that real living wage bracket. So it's a really hot topic for us. And I'm looking forward to learning from you and the other panelists today.
Amazing. Thank you so much, and delighted that you could join us today. David, I'm going to come on to you now.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here. My name is David Blackburn. I am the Chief People Officer of the Financial Services Compensation Scheme. We protect all regulated financial products in the UK. And since our launch in 2001, we've come to the aid of 6.5 million customers and paid out £26 billion in compensation. We're massively committed to equality, diversity and inclusion and are proud to be recognised as the UK's 12th most inclusive employer, a top 50 employer for women and a top 30 employer for working families.
Thank you, David. Super impressive, and I'm really excited about the conversation that's going to follow. And last but not least, our very own Jodie.
Hi there, my name is Jodie Cross. I am a Senior Social Impact Advisor to BITC members, working for around 4 years now in our advisory services, where we support businesses to strengthen their strategic approach to social impact. And I'm delighted to be here today.
Thank you, Jodie. Okay, so we're going to move on into the topic of social mobility. And social mobility is about a change in an individual's socio-economic status, which includes intergenerational mobility. We know that people from more disadvantaged backgrounds have fewer opportunities. And I'm going to ask Jodie just to expand on that for us a little bit. So Jodie, could you just come in and talk to us about what is socio-economic inclusion? How does this differ from social mobility, and why is it relevant to the cost of living crisis?
Yeah, thanks, Neha. So I think the terminology can get a little bit complex, but actually I think those two terms really do interact. So I think where social mobility is the descriptor of an individual's circumstances, socio-economic inclusion is the practice of change that a business adopts to enable better social mobility. But, you know, social mobility is a real long game, and where we're having to step up in the cost of living crisis is that the most socio-economic inclusive businesses are really concerned with the financial wellness of all employees right now. And I think often in the past, where we've seen some businesses have an approach to social mobility that tends to speak to, you know, a future employee coming into the business in a certain way, on a certain track, and hasn't really necessarily spoke to all employees already in the business who are doing the lowest paid, lowest skilled work. And so socioeconomic inclusion is the recognition of all employees in low socioeconomic circumstances, whether it's generational or not.
Really useful defining it and breaking it down in that way, Jodie. David and Caitlin, it would be great if you could build on this from a business lens. So why are social mobility and the cost of living crisis relevant to businesses? So David, could I start with you?
Yes, I mean, Jodie, great definition, and I think it's really clear, and absolutely Jodie's right. Those two terms completely interact with each other. But also if we think about the situation as businesses that we find ourselves in right now, so we are both facing into and living through a cost of living crisis. You know, the ONS has just published data this morning that shows that actually unemployment is up, and also salary inflation is up, you know, faster than they anticipated, but still well below the headline rate of inflation. So in real terms, for many organisations and many employees, they're facing actually a loss of earnings. So that's the reality. But also we know as businesses that, you know, it's a much overused term, the war for talent, you know, that we are in an environment where it is incredibly candidate-led, where we are all fishing, it certainly feels like in the financial services sector at least, in the same pool or the same talent. And so understanding that actually equity, diversity and inclusion is central to your business strategy. you know, actually what creates a competitive advantage for you as an organization. People want to go and work for organizations where they see themselves represented. You know, there is so much data that says, do I see myself represented on the board? Do I see myself represented at a senior level? And we've done huge work as organizations, and I know Caitlin will talk all about the amazing work that Capita have done. We've done a lot of work as organizations when we think about ED&I through some of those more traditional lenses. So actually a huge amount of effort has gone into into race, a huge amount of effort has gone into gender. Now, I just want to be absolutely clear, our work is not done in these places, but actually socio-economic inclusion, socio-economic mobility, lots of organizations know that's what we're going to share with people today, don't know where to start. They don't know how to begin. They don't know what the baseline is. And I know we'll talk about why data is so important. But absolutely, you cannot do, if I think about those two challenges, you cannot either target interventions, really great poll result that people are doing that, but it's very difficult to do that without meaningful data. And also, the other reason that the data is so important is you cannot shift the dial in your organization if you want to make the organization more socially, economically inclusive, unless you know what it looks like today. So that's for all those reasons, it's massively important.
Thank you, David. Yeah, some really rich points there around, and we'll come on to data more. Caitlin, I'm going to invite you to answer that question too.
Yeah, so without repeating anything David said, because I agree wholeheartedly with all of it, I guess to then personalize that with a couple of specific examples so that I'm not just repeating David. I used to work in a contact center. So when I was 19, I was working full-time in a contact center, inbound, taking 70 calls a day, probably a bit exaggeration, maybe it was 70 calls a week. And I wasn't in a position where I had the opportunity to get maybe the types of education, support, career progression that others did around me because they had a different family background. And I am now, in a very senior position in a very big organization. I know that there are hundreds of people like me who sit in our contact centers, in our frontline positions right now. And if we don't go and find those people and give them that extra bit of support that they need to have that level playing field, we're missing out on incredible talent that is just sitting in our organizations and unable to get that first step up. So to David's point about broadening the pool and the war for talent, it is beneficial for us as businesses to go and find those people and give them the extra hand that they need. Now, it's more complicated. I was in that position 20 years ago. Right now, because of the cost of living crisis, that situation is significantly exacerbated. So again, to make this personal to me, I'm a mum and I have some very small children. And there is a huge cost of childcare that, I face as a parent. I'm in a very privileged position because I can afford to pay it and keep working. However, the average cost of childcare for an under 2 in the UK right now is around £14,000. I know the government's just committed to a little bit of extra support, but it's not even kicking in for a couple of years. So let's not focus on that. But if we take someone who is on the average UK salary right now, which is around £38,000, after tax, say 29,800, then they're paying £14,000 for a child to be in full-time childcare. That person's got to live off £15,800 for everything else. And we know the cost of mortgage or rent or electricity or food, and they're all going up. So there's a strong likelihood that that person might end up having to leave the workforce because they cannot afford to work. Again, this is disproportionately impacting those from a lower socioeconomic background, those who are lower earners. That was that was average wage. The minimum wage, remembering, is pretty much going to be wiped out. I think you end up with about £1,500 left after childcare to pay for everything for a full year. You're just priced out of work. So are you aware as a business that a lot of your potential workforce and potentially brilliant employees might simply be priced out of working for you? That is a problem for us as business, and it means we're missing out on a huge number of incredible people who could be bringing value to our businesses, delighting customers, growing the economy, all the things that we want in order to be seeing successful returns as a business. And that's before you even get into our ethical or moral responsibility, but purely in business terms, then I would say as well, if you're a purpose-led business like we are at Capita, we are also interested in the non-financial and the ethical and social impact. So for us, it's pretty much a no-brainer when you look at positive business outcomes and positive social and community outcomes.
Thank you for those examples. They really resonated and I think really highlight the challenges in a kind of heartfelt way. I also started my career in a contact center. I remember sitting in this really tight booth and, was lucky enough to get to where I am in my career. But again, with the challenges that we're facing with the cost of living crisis, that's becoming harder and harder. So purpose-led businesses must take action in terms of recognizing where talent is and enabling them to be part of the future workforce planning. Some really brilliant points there, Caitlin. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on to data collection. We've talked a little bit about the importance of data and what it allows us to understand so that we can really build a picture of who's most in need and where the support is most beneficial. Data, however, doesn't tell the entire story. And, we know some of the challenges around data collection include things like anonymous data. People don't always respond to the questions and, just those missing pieces. So coming back to you, Caitlin, in your view as a business leader, why is data collection important for this issue?
Yeah, so it's such an interesting question and such a challenging area. My key, and I know we're going to talk about tips later, but my key here is sometimes the perfect can be the enemy of the good, because there is no perfect way to collect data. The data will never tell the whole story. But to the points David made earlier, if you don't have that data to give you a baseline, you don't even know your starting position, you don't know where the critical intervention points are, and you don't know if the interventions you make are making a difference. So I would say you need a baseline, and then sometimes the picture can seem so big that it's almost impossible to tackle. Having the data allows you to focus down into more specific areas where you can say, okay, this is a really big pocket. If we take this social mobility example, it might be that you can see across your workforce, you've got a specific pocket where you have particularly low socio-economic diversity. So it might be, for example, in actuaries or some niche part of your business. You can focus there to start. You don't have to tackle the whole business, and sometimes that can make it a little bit more digestible. But if you don't have the data, you can't find those pockets. And then if you do try an intervention 6, 12, 24 months later, you need to be able to see if it's working. And if it's not, you try something else. You change the dial a little bit. You talk to those people and find out what you need to do differently to have the impact that you're trying to deliver. But if you don't have that data to start, you simply don't know where to begin, and it can be an overwhelming situation.
David, if you could come in and just talk a little bit around how the FSCS has increased responses in their data collection, because Caitlin's really laid out how important it is to track progress and to understand, movements, but how have you kind of responded to data collection?
Yeah, and I just want to quickly build on what Caitlin said. So often, the FSCS is a relatively small organisation with about 250 employees. And so often what happens when I talk about these topics, people say, well, of course, it's easy for you at the FSCS, David, because there's only 250 of you. But actually, the principles apply irrespective of the size of the organisation. And I think Caitlin makes a really important point about where you start. Because actually, if you are a global organisation, you can't have a socio-economic strategy that's going to try and deliver all of that. Actually, but what the data will help you do is pinpoint where you start, because you can start in a team, you can start in a department, you can start in a. So that just really resonates with me, because people say, well, it's easy in a small organisation. Well, no, the principles are the same, I think, wherever they are. And to the question, Neha, about how we've increased our data collection. So I think it's a long journey, because actually we have been collecting data across all of the various protected characteristics quite some time, and actually building a high trust relationship with your workforce that says, so these are my top tips. So I think firstly, you always have to explain what the data is for. Why are you using it? So actually, you're not just randomly sending out things saying, please complete this questionnaire or please complete this data. I think it's also really important to relate the data to specific objectives. So actually, what we talk a lot in the organisation about our commitment to equity, diversity and inclusion. And we say we're committed to creating an inclusive environment. And the only way in which we can do that is by using the data. I want to understand, how can I level the playing field in this organisation if I don't know what the playing field is? So that's, I think, a really, really important message. I think the last thing that we did last year is that we cross-referenced some of our existing data from our people survey. So in our annual people survey, we ask a lot of questions around equity, diversity, and inclusion and belonging. So the 3 key questions: I would describe the organisation as a caring and inclusive employer. I feel like I truly belong, and I can be myself every day at work. Now, we know that those numbers are 91% and 88% for the other 2 questions. So at the beginning of last year, we ran a little campaign, which included a video of me saying, look at these numbers. These numbers are amazing. That's great. That's fantastic. I'd like to understand, therefore, why you tick prefer not to say. Because if you're telling me this is a caring and inclusive thing, I'd rather you tick the boxes. And I very openly said, I am a white, non-disabled, LGBT plus atheist man, middle-aged man. There you go. You know, I'll just tell you. And actually, the only people who see that data are the people team. And the only reason we're using that data is back to my first point. What are you using the data for? To create a level playing field in the organisation. And what we saw over a period of 3 months is our disclosure rates are all above 95%. And we're collecting socio-economic data for the first time. We've just finished that exercise, and we've got a 94% response rate across the organisation, including our board. So tell them what the data is for, build a culture that says, I'm asking for this because I want to use it to make a difference. What am I going to use it for to make a difference? And say, I need the whole picture in order to create an organisation in which you feel that you truly belong.
I love that. I love the storytelling of the data and really landing why that data is important with people, you know, people at the heart. Thank you, David. Jodie, could you just come in and talk to us about what data businesses can collect to target support, and also what can't data collection tell us?
Yeah, definitely. So I think, I mean, just to hopefully not repeat, but echo a couple of points that Caitlin and David have meant. So I think there's a lot of understanding that we can get from existing insights that we already have. And just to, you know, really make sure that we don't treat social mobility in isolation as a data collection capture. You know, something that exists separate from other pay gap and protected characteristics data. You know, I would say it's a complete own goal if we're not striving to know how many Black women of low socio-economic status we employ and where their representation lies across pay bands and business units, because it's giving us that fuller picture of multiple aspects of diversity and whether we still have bias towards levels of privilege in certain backgrounds. And given that we know, you know, to echo a point that Caitlin made earlier, given we know that caring responsibility is still falling disproportionately to women, you know, are we looking at take-home pay versus salaried pay? Because someone's prorated pay on a fairly decent middle income could tell a very different financial story for that household compared to a single person household. So what on paper could be a social mobility gain could not actually translate into a financial security for that woman. Are we looking at regional disparities? And do we have specific targets for regions linked to external regional social mobility data? You know, is our social mobility pay gap the widest in, say, the Northeast? And yet this is where the majority of our low paid and low skilled positions are, with most of our opportunities for progression in the Southeast. And of course, there are things that we don't know about our employee circumstances that we wish we had richer data sets on, you know, that are all linked to the structural barriers to advancing social mobility. You know, what are people's childcare costs? What are their housing status? You know, do they have asset wealth? Do they have any savings? You know, is this the only income that's coming into that household? You know, a deeper picture into employees' financial well-being is of course needed, but there's a lot we already have access to that we're not intersecting with socioeconomic data.
Thank you, Jodie. Some really interesting thoughts there around how we can get into that kind of segmentation and deeper understanding. Okay, I'm going to move us on to our final topic, which is about inequalities. And Jodie, just back to you. Could you share with us what can we do to take a more inclusive and equitable approach to targeting social mobility, especially in the cost of living crisis and beyond?
Yeah, so I think we're seeing mutual persistent issues that are now affecting business and society together. We've got labour and skill shortages coupled with insecure work, low wage stagnation, and it's telling us that underinvestment in diverse groups for a long period of time now is no longer working, and it's calling for a clear change for the system to be more inclusive, to access that talent that's already there, rather than expecting people to fit to our business as usual. And a lot of that for an individual business begins and ends with having that clear knowledge and then accountability to where financial instability and poverty may exist across the business already. And of course, really importantly, where bias remains to progressing people who have more privilege. The BITC members that I've worked with and I've seen create the most ambitious work are really clear on what the state of play is across the business. Through our advisory work, we've done socio-economic reviews with members who just weren't aware that some of their business strategy and practices in their current form were just going to trip them up in terms of progressing social mobility. So looking across the business is really key to understanding where factors like pay, benefits, outreach, talent strategy, progression, core business, all has a footprint on a place and a household. So I think your baseline is also about understanding where in the business you have practices still linked to enabling people with more socioeconomic privilege to thrive. I recently did a review for a company who had no set standards for out of cycle remuneration or progression. And they told me, we want to leave the door open for those that think that they've done a really good job and that can come and ask. But the problem with that is there might be a certain bias towards people who feel more entitled and empowered to ask. And that can come from having a more financially empowered background. So I think it's about reaching across the business and really understanding where it is, where your baseline is beyond data, and looking at business practice.
Yeah, so that deep dive knowledge is going to be critical as part of this. David, how does FSCS ensure that all employees are included within the socio-economic inclusion?
So, and this also picks up on, because there's lots of questions flying in about what questions we ask and what do we do with the questions. So being really candid, this is the first time that we've asked this set of questions. And I'll just say a little bit about the work that we're doing with an organisation called Progress Together. So at the end of last year, during 2022, the City of London commissioned a socio-economic task force to look at the financial services sector specifically. And it was a survey of 9,000 employees across 49 firms. And what it found, perhaps not surprisingly, is some quote statistics. So I looked down, so I remember them. The survey found that employees from professional backgrounds are 43% more likely to be senior level compared to their working class peers. Of all the senior leaders surveyed in financial services sector, 64% were from a professional background. And actually that they then, and a theme that I think we're all talking about is the data only tells part of the story. Because actually, and that compares, that's more than double if you apply that same characteristic to the UK wider population. So financial services sector is massively disproportionately non-socioeconomically diverse. Also, what the survey found was that working class respondents are more likely to feel they do not have the same chances of success in the workplace. They are more likely to feel like an outsider. And over a third, and only a third, benefited from having a senior sponsor, compared with almost 2/3 of people from a privileged background. When Jodie was talking about company that she worked for, who said, we have an open door policy to allow you to come in. You might have seen the wry smiles on Caitlin and nice faces, because, you know, of course that advantage gives advantage to those people with a privileged background, albeit that might not be their intention. And we know that socioeconomic background then amplifies all the other inequalities. So if you then happen to be exactly as Jodie said, if you happen to be a woman of colour, you know, then actually the chances are you're even less likely to feel included in the workplace. So Progress Together is a membership organisation that was post the task force ending, was set up to try and challenge that and to try and change the landscape. And the only way that we can do that is by doing it collectively together. So what we're doing with the data, so that's again back to my earlier point about how do we get people to complete the data. That's the story that we've been telling. We've said, look, we want to change the dial in this sector. This is the sector that we operate in and that we work. We want to do that. So we've become a member of this organisation, and part of that commitment is to collect the socioeconomic data, which now we're all feeding in. So all the members of Progress Together, well, the idea being that actually we're going to have a baseline idea about what's going on within our own organisations. And then what are the practical steps about where do we think? And a bit back to Caitlin's point that she was saying, you know, is it insurance or is it in actuaries, or where are those real hotspots where we could start to make difference, and what might some of those practical steps be? So just to be clear, all the people going, what are you doing with it? We're right at the, you know, we are sort of at the beginning of this journey. You know, we've collected the data, the idea being that, you know, we're going to work with Progress Together to identify practical actions, not just for the FSCS, but more broadly, in order to shift the dial within the financial services sector.
Caitlin, I'm going to invite you in for final thoughts, just to build on what David shared from a Capita perspective.
Yeah, of course. And similarly, and I'll talk about this more in a couple of minutes, we're very early in our journey on social mobility. So it's very much an evolving story. However, critically, I think that intersectionality piece is really important, but also the positive of social mobility. And I'm very shamelessly stealing this from a fantastic man called Tunde Banjoko, who runs the Social Mobility Awards. And I'm not sure he quite described it like this, so I apologize if I'm paraphrasing him, but effectively social mobility is kind of like a gateway into diversity and inclusion for a lot of people, because social mobility can affect people from all of the other different protected characteristics. And sometimes, you know, I do, when I'm working in some of my other diversity areas, a white, cisgendered, straight male can come up to me and say, well, I don't really feel seen, but I didn't have a lot of opportunities in my life either. And this is where social mobility can sometimes unlock that inclusion conversation for people who may have felt excluded, because you could have someone who does appear to be from, you know, a more privileged set of characteristics, but in fact grew up in a council estate in the north of England and didn't have opportunities and lived in extreme poverty. And suddenly this conversation can unlock for them an understanding about their privilege or lack of it, and also help them understand perhaps the conversation around some of those other characteristics. And when you start to layer them, to David's point, yeah, if you're a Black woman from a low socioeconomic background, you're just layering on this lack of privilege. And I always love that really simple, it's a very viral video, which kind of lines college kids up in the US and says, take a step forward if this happens, take a step forward and forward. And you see, you know, these kids that are halfway along the field, and then you've got these kids that are right at the back because they've had none of those advantages. And what I like about that video, and if you haven't found it, seen it, go and have a look, is that the point is everyone's different. It's not like if you are from the LGBT plus community, you're at this point of the line, or if you're Black, you're at this point of the line, or if you're a woman, you're at this point. Everyone's experiences are far more nuanced, which is why the data doesn't tell us everything about you as a human being. But if we don't start with this data as a baseline, then we don't have any place to start to make those interventions. So I think in terms of including everyone, it's really important to recognize that we're all human. We've all had different experiences, opportunities, and privileges. It doesn't make you a bad person if you've had all of the privilege in the world, but it gives you an opportunity to be an ally and maybe look at how can you transfer some of that privilege you've had to others. And wherever you sit on that spectrum of privilege, what can you do to help some other people, give them an opportunity perhaps that they haven't had before. And it really, for me, unlocks a conversation that can include everybody.
Really beautifully said, Caitlin. And Emma's popped up, which means that we're out of time. So thank you so much. That was just a fabulous conversation and so many rich insights and takeaways. I'm going to hand you back to Emma, who's going to now take a bit of a deeper dive into this. So thank you from me.
Thank you so much, Neha. Thank you so much to our speakers. That was really, really, really fascinating. And a couple of key takeaways from me. Data is where to start, and that really guides the direction and the action. Socio-economic background is amplifies the other protected characteristics, but simultaneously it unlocks inclusion. So a really fascinating discussion, and thank you so much. One of the things that we know that our audiences really like is kind of a section on how organisations are practically doing this. So we'd like to turn now to Caitlin first and ask how you're targeting social mobility in the cost of living crisis using data and what support you're doing. We've got a couple of minutes each, and then we'll move into questions and answers. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks, Neha. And I'll try and be succinct because I know that time's always a challenge. So a couple of quick points. Firstly, I can see a few questions in the chat around data. So just to share our experience, we are launching social mobility questions at the moment. We're just in that project. And the challenge for us is because we're global, we didn't want to use the social mobility 4 questions, which I can see a number of people referencing because they don't work for us globally. Great in the UK. So we are using one question, which is around parental occupation or the main household earner occupation at the age of 14. And then we use a categorization to therefore put people into kind of an A, B, or C category based on that. As I said before, it is not perfect. And the story we are telling around this as we start to build our narrative is that this will not put you in a box that sums up everything you are in life. It just gives us one piece of the puzzle to help with that analysis. But it definitely isn't, a whole picture of you as an individual. An example I use is you could have been the child of a doctor, and that puts you into that higher category. But in fact, your parent might have had mental health conditions, not been able to work certain parts of life, and you could have actually grown up in quite a difficult environment. That doesn't mean you got all the privilege that could be associated with that particular parental occupation, but it just allows us to look at averages. And that's why we don't look at individual human beings in this process anyway. Everything is aggregate data, not kind of one person's experience. So that's the question that we're asking. Now, I don't have a lot of data on use of that because we're only launching it at the moment. But what I can tell you is how we've used a lot of our other data successfully. Particularly our 2 focus areas over the past 18 months have been on women in senior leadership and ethnic diversity in senior and middle leadership. Because again, the data told us they were 2 of our core challenge areas. So in terms of what do we do when we've got that data? We use it for a lot. So again, I would like to stress, you don't have to start with all of this. Pick 1 or 2 things and do them well, rather than trying to scattergun. But as examples, we review our performance ratings by gender and ethnic diversity, and sometimes other characteristics, but I'm focusing on those as our primary 2 at the moment. So that means we see if you are a woman in different parts of the business, how likely are you to get an A, B, or C rating? For example, you could have any form of rating in your business. And we also look at, for example, the difference between employee rating and manager rating. So as an employee, I get to go in annually and rate myself against my objectives, and then my manager rates me. What's interesting is, how do those ratings change? So if I'm a woman, am I more likely to be uprated or downrated by my manager, or kept the same? And if I am, for example, Black, mixed race, Asian, are those ratings more likely to go up or down or stay the same? That tells us a story of potentially implicit or unconscious bias in the organization, or practices that are somehow inequitable to specific groups. So that's one. You can apply exactly the same methodology for pay rises, which we also do. So live during our pay rise process, we have a system that shows us the average pay rise that's being given to women in the business and the average pay rise that's being given to people who are white, and non-white in various specific categories. We can then go and intervene in that business and ask some questions. So if we can see in one part of the business that people who are Black are getting on average a 2% pay rise and people who are white are getting on average a 3% pay rise, we can question that and try and find out why is that the case and is there a problem we need to address there. We also apply it to employee survey feedback, which David's already mentioned. So I can go through every question in our annual employee survey and see how differently people rate it depending on their characteristics. So for example, if we can see that employees who identify as trans employees are feeling like they don't belong in Capita, that tells us that we need to go and do some specific work with our Rainbow Alliance, our LGBTQ+ employee network group, and run some sessions specifically around trans inclusion. And we can do that because the data told us that specific group of employees felt less engaged. And we can also do that intersectionally. So I can see, for example, the different scores on average that Black women who also have a disability, how those people are answering that question in a specific part of the business. Now, again, there are so many layers of intersectionality. You have to start somewhere, identify the biggest issues and address them. You can't throw your energy at everything unless you have a really, really big team, which most D&I professionals I work with don't. But pick the areas where you can see the biggest variances and then focus there. There's so many more, so I'm going to really quickly whistle through a couple of others. Recruitment pipelines, where are people dropping off in pipelines? Target setting, performance reviews, I've talked about, succession planning and promotions are the other ones as well. So review your succession planning pipeline. What are you seeing in terms of variances and things like bonus payments as well. Now, in terms of all of those things, then that's going to give you a lot of data about where maybe things are working well and where they're not. So you can identify an intervention that's appropriate for that particular problem and then test again 6 months, 12 months later to see if it's having an impact. But there's also a broader piece about generally bringing your culture along. So the other thing I would say is treating this like any other business problem. Make sure for your business leaders, they are getting regular reports or metrics that they can access to show their progress, that this is built into their performance objectives and bonus where appropriate, and that you're looking at this in terms of your own promotion practices as well. So what I mean by that is if we're looking at the people in our succession planning pipeline for senior roles, we look at their inclusion scores through the employee survey, for example, and that is a factor that plays into whether we think they're appropriate as a future senior leader. So if their employees and their teams are saying they're not an inclusive leader, that for us is a flag that this person might need some more development. We might need to look into that a little bit more, but they might not be appropriate for promotion right now. So you need to treat this as a holistic set of opportunities to create a different kind of culture if you've got problems that you need to address. Of course, if you look at all the data and the data is perfect, there aren't big variances between different groups, then you might not need to do anything. But I'm yet to see an organization which doesn't identify some significant variances. Last very quick point, because I'm sorry, I know we're quite late, is supporting your lowest paid employees. So we're a real living wage employer, so please consider doing that if you're not already. It's a really important way to help support your lowest earning employees. We also target our pay rises, particularly in the last round with the cost of living crisis. So we tapered. So basically people in the lower part of the organization got the biggest pay rises, and then people in senior leadership all agreed to take, optionally, but agreed to take no pay rise. Now, I know someone in the chat, I think, commented about the fact that people, even at the upper end of the pay scale, are still absorbing massive cost of living crisis impacts. And we acknowledge that when we speak to our employees about financial well-being, benefits, and other things we can offer. But for us, if you're a family making a decision between heating your house or feeding your kids, that is more important. And so we are still focusing our financial, kind of the crux of our financial opportunities at the bottom of the organization. But we are doing more. We have a Level app where employees can go and take loans against their own pay. We do not want our employees going to payday loan sharks. So we offer that internally ourselves instead. And we do a lot of work around financial well-being, mental health associated with that. And we're also looking to do some more work around stigma around financial well-being as well. And this will be my last point, I promise. Stigma is a really interesting one in the social mobility space. I think a lot of people traditionally have felt the need to hide their socio-economic status in the same way that people will hide if they're in financial difficulty. It's not comfortable to talk about. It comes with a lot of shame, particularly for men, I think, although certainly not saying it's isolated to men. So ultimately, in terms of addressing some of these issues around both social mobility and cost of living crisis, my key encouragement to you would be make it a safe space for people to talk about these things, to acknowledge their background, to acknowledge that they might not be from a wealthy, privileged background and that they might be struggling financially. That's okay. It's okay to admit, it's okay to talk about, and we should be offering support or avenues for support for these people, because it can be a really significant mental health issue. We know there's a lot of suicides linked to financial well-being or lack thereof. So if you can create safe spaces for your employees to talk about it, that's also another critical and immediate intervention that you can take. I will stop now, I apologize, and hand over to Emma.
Not at all. That was incredible. So practical and intersectional in the way that you've considered multiple kind of aspects of recruitment, performance, succession planning, and then that financial stigma piece, really important. Thank you so much. David, can you share with us what you're doing at the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, especially in terms of the support in the cost of living crisis?
Yes, I mean, three things that I just not surprisingly, very similar to Caitlin's the way. So firstly, I think once you've got the data, you do have to set targets. Targets are what make a difference. So actually, as a signatory of the Women in Finance Charter, we set ourselves a target that we would have a 50% gender split across our leadership population by March 2022, that we would have 20% female representation in underrepresented areas like IT and data, that we would have LGBT plus representation, visible representation at every level from our board down through the organisation, and that 25% of our leaders would be Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, which is why I'm delighted to be able to say to you today that the FSCS, our gender pay gap is 1.45% in favour of women, and we're probably one of the only financial services organisations to do that. So targets. And then equally, once you've set the targets, then you need targeted interventions, because absolutely, like Caitlin, I absolutely love the film about that. Nothing explains equity better than that video. Equality is treating everybody the same is simply not enough, because it doesn't level the playing field. So once you've got targets, targeted interventions, we've done a lot of work around our Black Talent Sponsorship Programme, the Stonewall Leadership Programme, interventions around female leadership. So actually, how do you then, knowing that the playing field isn't level, how do you level it? Well, actually, you need to target those interventions. We are a real living wage employer like Capita. And lastly, the thing that I would say, which really came out of the pandemic for us, is non-anonymous surveys. So actually, what we did during the first lockdown, like lots of organisations who were issuing pulse surveys about people's mental well-being, we very openly said, we want this to be non-anonymous. We want to flag. It's no good if you're scoring 3 on a 6-point scale and saying, actually, I'm feeling mentally unwell, or I'm coping, or I'm finding it very difficult to switch off, or all of those questions I think we were all asking. If we want to help you, we need to know that that's the reality for you. And that took a while. I have to say, that didn't happen overnight. But actually, I think the fact that we really said we want to create the psychological safety, the space for you to say, I am struggling. So actually, we've had targeted support in relation to the cost of living crisis using a very similar methodology, where we've said, if you are struggling, we want to know about it. So we've done, and the wrapper that we've put around all of this is called what we call taking control. Because again, Caitlin's absolutely right about the stigma that that comes with all of this. So, and we know, I'm very fortunate, we're both very fortunate to be part of the cost of living BIT's cost of living task force. And only on Friday, Step Change, the debt charity we're talking about, people often reach out for help when it's too late. They come, but because they've been trying to resolve it for themselves. And actually, what was really interesting, so actually we've tried to make it a positive thing by saying this is all about take control. So our Take Control campaign is take control of your well-being, take control of your personal development, take control of your financial well-being. And what can we do to help you? We can do lots of things around financial education, which might not just be about pensions and savings, also about mortgages and when to renew your mortgage, and better credit card rates and all of that good stuff that we have access to a number of our partners. But also then being able to say, okay, we have got a budget to help us target those responses. So we repurpose funds to say, well, we gave everybody some money towards Christmas because we said, actually, the cost of the festive season, what do people really want? Actually, do they want a big Christmas party? Or would they rather have a £100 Sainsbury's voucher? Or could they have a bit of both? Actually, we did have some nice mulled wine and mince pies in the office. But more seriously, actually using that non-anonymous survey for people to say, I am feeling really anxious about my financial well-being. And if they were scoring low, actually, when they're scoring low, wherever we saw anybody who we thought actually you're scoring below 3, we then proactively reached out to them. So we said, okay, thank you for being really honest, Caitlin, Emma, Jodie, on your survey. Actually, what can we do to help you? And that might be, we had a limited pot, a sort of emergency pot of money that we said, okay, we will match as a minimum, we will match the government's £400 bill payment that they paid everybody in November. So targeted interventions do require a level of, to be really effective. I think you have to have created quite a high trust culture that people, and even if it's not non-anonymous, you're getting that data that people, there's the psychological safety that people feel they can put their hands up and say, actually, because we know, and I really took that away from the meeting on Friday, step change saying, the sooner you flag this, the sooner you try to access help, the more likely it is that your employer is going to be able to help you get it right.
Huge thanks. Very impressive, the level of psychological safety that has been created in financial services compensation scheme. We've got a bit of time now for questions and answers from our audience. So you've been putting your questions all the way through this webinar, so thank you so much. I think some of them speakers have been answering as they've been going, which has been really nice, but I've got a couple here to ask the panel. Building on that point of psychological safety, we've got a question on how you are using the plans and the actions and how you're communicating with your workforce, and then how you're creating the safe spaces. David, you spoke a little bit about this in your answer just now. Is there anything else that you would add in terms of how employers can do this?
I mean, I think it's linked. It's a point that Caitlin made earlier, and that I think we've all made, is that you can't see these things as separate ideas or separate initiatives, or this is the organisation's response to this particular thing. At the FSCS, we've been members of business in the community since 2014. So for us, this is very much about the responsible business narrative. The FSCS is a responsible business, and that means, therefore, that we are interested in healthy business, healthy communities, and a healthy environment. So I think that's for us, it's not saying we know that the cost of living crisis is a new thing. We know that we haven't collected data on socio-economic mobility before, but this isn't some new. It's like, oh, we should be doing this. It's actually saying, no, what we want to understand, what we want you to understand is all of these things are part of our commitment to you to create a healthy business, because we want to be responsible. And I think that is I think that's really important. The narrative that you put, this is a joined up campaign that's part of an ongoing commitment to EDI, responsible business, that it's not, it's Caitlin said, it's not some new thing that you're doing and you're just doing it over here separately because it's interesting. No, actually, we will continue to add it, we'll continue to shift our areas of focus as we want to, in creating an inclusive environment requires us to tackle all of these things. And we can't, very, very wise, I was smiling very broadly when Caitlin said, you can't tackle it all at once. You can't, you absolutely can't, and you will not be successful. So finding the right place to start, but I think constantly reminding people why you're doing it and telling them the story, that I think is the thing that creates the safe space.
Constantly reminding, telling the story, and grounding it back into a responsible business. And thank you so much. Caitlin, anything you would build on that from your perspective at Capita?
I mean, I agree with everything that David said. The other thing I'd probably add is sometimes messages are better coming from our employee network groups or employee resource groups, whatever you call them, if you have them. If you don't, I would recommend them. because these are trusted colleagues and friends, and they often already have safe spaces to talk about things. So our employee network groups are amazing, and they can have conversations that I can't walk into a room and have with that group of people, because they'll be like, oh, your headquarters, you're listening to me, what are you thinking, what are you writing down? But they can have that safe space. So we have amazing committees and chairs in those different groups, and they hold these conversations for us, and then they tell us and they feed things back to us. But I think sometimes you have to create the organic space for these groups to hold the space themselves, and then they hold those conversations. And that could be anything from in a menopause cafe that we run, these kinds of things might come up, to a wellbeing event, to in our Black employee network. But wherever employees feel more safe and feel that there is a level of trust, pushing those conversations out to those groups is often a great way to have the conversations. And you might need to not be in the room so that employees can have that, but make sure there's a mechanism for that feedback to come back to you.
That's really interesting that if from a colleague perspective, when it comes from a colleague, the level of safety that's increased. Jodie, you work with businesses in every single sector on this topic all the time. Is there any final reflections from you that you would share with our audience before we wrap up?
I think, something that we probably haven't discussed too much is, I think one of the biggest factors in declaration is showing employees you are utterly committed to change at all levels, which may actually mean a pay cap at the top also. We want to see remuneration committees make bold decisions on narrowing pay gaps, because we also know that the poorest and the richest in the society are both the most socially immobile of groups, and that scale has a specific causal relationship. Social mobility is about a distribution of wealth, and I think we need to start having those conversations as well.
Yeah, really, really important point. Thank you, Jodie. Well, we have had, the time has absolutely flown by. We've got 2 minutes left, so I'm going to move into wrap up. Is there any last words from anybody that anybody would like to say on the panel?
Only that, you can make change can happen. I always, whenever I come on any of these calls, I always want to say to people, yes, you think, oh God, it's yet another thing that I've got on my to-do list, another thing I don't know where to start. And I just think you can start somewhere, and just do start. I think is the call to action. You can make change happen. You can make change happen. Any very final words from you, Caitlin?
I think that to echo David, if you can't do a lot, just pick one thing and do it. And even you'll never make everyone happy. Whichever one you pick, it's like picking a favorite child. It's very difficult, but just pick one thing and do it well. And then hopefully you'll be able to go on to the next and the next and the next.
Pick one thing and do it well. Thank you so much, our panel. Neha, for chairing our panel. What an incredible session. I have learned so much. A call to action from us, please complete the survey that we will be sending out to you. Events team, if you can just get that slide of our call to action. But we've got a QR code on there with our cost of living action plan. David talked earlier about our cost of living task force. If you could just go to the next slide, please. We'll be amplifying support for employees, customers, communities and suppliers across the cost of living crisis. We've got BITC's expert team. You've heard from Jodie today on all the support we can offer with advisory. And then as well, please do join our Opening Doors campaign, because we heard as well how important it is in terms of our recruitment, and not our recruitment, everybody is recruitment that's on this call. All of that will be on an email as well. So that's it from us. Thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone.